So I have the great pleasure of being here with Thomas Legrand. Thomas, thank you so much for joining the Middle Way podcast.
Thanks, Matthew, for inviting me.
So I was mentioning to you before we started recording here that your book was just simply amazing. I can try to describe in words how much I enjoyed it, or I can show you the notepad of all the notes that I took here from your book, and still a little bit more to go. But so comprehensive and just really, really shows how much thought that you have been putting into this for so many years, as you say. There are so many different directions that we can go. There are so many different pieces of the book that we could digest, and hopefully we'll get to some of those things. But I thought maybe starting out with kind of a bit of a broader overview of some of the concepts that you describe. One of the things that you present to us in the book is our current paradigm for the way that we're living, or the current story that we're in, which you and others like Charles Eisenstein have referred to as the story of separation. And this new paradigm that we seem to be moving towards, or that at least you're hoping that we're moving towards, which is the story of interbeing. And so I thought maybe we could at least start there at a very high level and describe these things for people, maybe starting with the story of separation. What does that mean, and what does that look like in our lives, and how is that sort of manifesting and playing out in our everyday lives?
So indeed, I build on the work of Charles Eisenstein for describing this story of separation. So basically, it is based on the recognition that each culture has its own ways of answering universal questions, such as, who we are, where we are coming from, how reality works, what is possible, etc. And the story of separation is based on a worldview which probably originates in the Western world with modernity, around a set of values such as individualism, materialism, reductionism, anthropocentrism, and it corresponds to some of the answers that science, but also philosophy, I would say, has given to these questions, and emphasizing that we are separated from nature, that we are also separated from each other, and tend to rather focus on our own material interest as Homo economicus, for example, as it has been developed in the economic science. And that the world is purely material, not conscious. It doesn't have any specific direction, but is more moved by random evolution. So all of this translate, these cultural paradigms translate also into a kind of a program for our societies and how we approach our development. And it has led to a focus on economic growth, and a program focused on mastering nature through science and technology to respond to our material self-interest, which in these stories are the ones that are given more weight.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you write that, we have focused on economic capital at the expense of social and environmental capital. And as you just said a moment ago, our model's really focused on economic growth. That seems to be sort of what we're serving, almost like the God that we're serving, if you will. Can you say a little bit more about that, like how that model works, this model of, continued economic growth, and why that is potentially not sustainable for us, or maybe just why that's the wrong focus for our attention in a society or in our politics?
Well, I would say that economic growth was supposed to be, a mean rather than an end in itself. It was there was a belief that, and partially true, that material prosperity will help improve our lives. But the problem is that I would say it has become an end in itself. And for two reasons, I would say. First, we didn't have a proper way to assess what is well-being and quality of life, and that is now developing, and it suggests different focus more on indeed our relationship to ourselves, one another, and nature. But also, I think, in my book, the subtitle is Wisdom and Science for a New Development Paradigm. I think this paradigm has also come from the fact that we shied away from deeper discussions regarding, the ends of our lives, mainly because that was associated to historically with religions. And modernity, as it developed in the West, was an anti-religious movement. And somehow the question of, which ends are to pursue, which values we should honor in societies, have not been given enough attention. And that's why we just follow, an economic system that is unsustainable, and feeds on the destruction of society and the environment as a way to just perpetuate itself, because we are not and I think we really need to make that shift to really ask ourselves, what does the good life looks like, and keep economy and technology as a way to pursue this good life. And there's as I mentioned in the book, there's a lot of science, that science of happiness and human flourishing, that can tell us what are the conditions that we should focus on to support collective well-being.
Hmm. Yeah, I love how you blend both science and spirituality in your work. And I also love how you sort of framed these past, several hundred years almost as like a reaction to religion, or an anti-religious movement. And I think what you're advocating for here is some sort of rediscovery of these values that might be found in religion, but not exclusively within religion, something that we can borrow or recreate, or blend with current contemporary scientific understandings as well. And it seems like this is sort of the focus here, on shifting from focusing on outer things to the inner development of these values and these qualities as a human being. Can you say a little bit more about these things, and what, I think, you would term spirituality very broadly. It can mean all of these different sort of qualities that we can bring into our life. But how would you define spirituality, or how would you define what the focus is on inner development?
Yes, very good question. So the starting point for this work is for this proposal of a new development paradigm focused on being, is the Earth Charter, which is a very important document. There have been a lot of debates to write that text in 2000. And it says, when basic needs have been met, human development is primarily about being more rather than having more. So what does that mean, being? And to me, it's how I would also define spiritual development. And I just say that being is becoming who we are, the best version of ourselves. And that is, to me, a definition of spiritual development that is not religious and should be and very simple. But really, all this tension between the subjective part of expressing our true nature, and that this process leads us to express at the same time human qualities that are good for society. So there's a tension between the subjective individual part, and the more objective virtues, and qualities that, you know, philosophers from all times, from Aristotle to Confucius, said the purpose of the good state, of the good society, is to help their members to cultivate their virtue, their human qualities. But sometimes it has led to some morality that does not allow people to express really who they are. So I think it's important to have these two aspects that complete each other. And I would say they both combine into you know, when we express our true nature, because you know, mystics from all traditions have told us basically that there is a common and it's a recent acknowledgement. I'm talking with people who have been pioneered in this field. A couple of decades ago, they didn't realize they were, you know, experiencing the same thing that can be called by different names, you know, unity consciousness, oneness, interbeing. But that is the fundamental experience of where who we are connect us with everything else, and from there comes a sense of service, of willingness to serve others, of goodness, etc. So that's how these two aspects of, you know, our true nature and the best version of ourselves can converge.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
No, I mean, I can expand then. You know, I was because you had your question about these values. So when I was doing this work, it took me 10 years of research and writing, and I was trying to identify where the seeds of this new development paradigm emphasizing being are, and also somehow where are the seeds of this new cultural narrative around you know, the story of interbeing. And I found it in a few communities which are where we see that science that have developed have scientific field of research, but also at the core of social change, political initiatives. So these are, all of these are chapters in my book. So the first one, I call it understanding. We could say understanding of our interconnectedness, and we can find that in systemic, complex, and integral thinking. The other one, I call it life, as you know, how we can organize ourselves in harmony with how nature works. That's really what is emphasized by the regeneration movement. And we can see that in political philosophy, such as Buen Vivir, or how China, for example, wants to become an ecological civilization. The other one is happiness. We know that more and more this happiness lens is becoming very important for countries like, you know, Bhutan and the gross national happiness, New Zealand, the well-being budget, and other Nordic European countries. And then we have love, or empathy and compassion. So we have science developing around that. We have, for example, an initiative like the Charter for Compassion, with more than 400 cities, local governments that have committed to become compassionate cities. Peace, there's a culture of peace concepts in the United Nations, or culture of partnership. Mindfulness, we have also, for example, in the UK, a proposal by many members of parliament from different parties that have explored how to harness the potential of mindfulness in public policies in 4 sectors, etc. The last one I emphasize, I call it mystery, and it's really acknowledging that a more advanced society would look more deeply into, including with science, you know, into the mystery of our lives and universe. So I was trying to make sense, you know, what is a common feature of all these communities, and somehow I found like they relate to highest values, and I call them spiritual values as the foundations of the politics of being. And I started to recognize that, you know, there was a long tradition, even in Western philosophy, to recognize, for example, truth, goodness, and beauty, the Platonic transcendentals, that have been the template, that have been sought as a template for the good society in the Western world. And even the church recognized, the Catholic Church recognized that, said they were the image of God. So, they kind of reflect, because they are the highest value, they kind of reflect an absolute to which, as we grow spiritually, we tend to reflect more and more these values. And I would say, as societies, it is exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. So all of these, Thomas, are components of what you're referring to as being, correct?
Exactly. I would say like being is a kind of, it's almost being, I would say, is almost non-being, it's like an absolute that express itself in the world through these values and qualities, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how, so this, because there are science around all these values, it can tell us how to cultivate them at the individual and collective level. So it's also a very concrete pathways to implement these new development paradigm. Based on all these values, we can develop very concrete policy agendas in many sectors, as I do in the book. I have 9 sectoral chapters, as you have seen, and they, most of the recommendation often derive from initiatives and research articulated around these values.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that one reaction that comes up for people in hearing about this kind of shift or proposal for a new politics of being is that, well, if we just focus on these inner qualities, how is the outer going to change? Or how can we actually like get anything done if we're just focused on human flourishing or development or something along those lines? Sounds wonderful, beautiful, I'm on board, but will that really shift our society? How would you kind of respond to that?
Well, first, I think is that just a recognition that the primacy of being. So, what we are actions in the world originates from within, from our minds and hearts. So that's why, especially as we're now, because of the civilizational crises we are facing, if we try to find, common relationships to all, all what is wrong in the world today, we end up looking at our culture and at our individual mindsets, right? So our hearts. So how, because of the systemic crisis, we need to look into that direction. Second, I would say, so there I distinguish 2 aspects in terms of policies. One are more, I would say, direct investment in being. So, for example, in the education system, what's interesting is that, while you cultivate, all these human qualities, the research tells us that they tend to make us also better in terms of academic achievements. So it's not a trade-off. Rather, it supports our capacity to learn, and yeah. So that's direct investment. But at the same time, it's also recognizing that each of our institutions have their own logic, and by their own logic, they cultivate certain mindsets, certain values, certain qualities. And one important point is the recognition that most of our institutions are based on this overall cultural narrative of separation, or we can say, on the vision that we are selfish, competitive human beings. And because they assume that, at the same time, they enact this vision. And I build on the work of Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And she said, like, the main lesson she has learned from 50 years of research is exactly that, the problem of these assumptions over human nature. And she says, institutions should rather be designed to bring out the best in humans. We can very a simple example, we have each societies have to deal with some challenges. So, for example, we have a justice system. The common justice system, and it's particularly true evident in the US, is based on a paradigm of retributive justice. So if someone does something wrong, we need to punish him or her, right? And this system is really not working from many point of view, whether of cost or of time, of mass and incarceration, even of recidivism. And it really nourish our instinct for retaliation. If we look at the alternative system, restorative justice, where you bring the offenders, the victim, and all the community together for a more conscious dialogue. So that's a way to render justice that is indeed much more effective, but at the same time, beyond the issues it is attending, all the people, it's an opportunity for all the people to practice these human values of deep listening, understanding, courage, taking responsibility, etc., etc. So, if all our institutions, even our political institutions and party politics, it's really turning into a fight and eroding civic virtues. So how we can design, and I propose very concrete solutions in the book, how we can design our political institutions in a way that will not nurture this sense of separation and competition for power, which really is make us completely unable to deal with the complex challenges we are now facing as societies in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. So really what we've been missing is focusing on really our hearts and cultivating those qualities of being, which would then help kind of our behaviors and the manifestation of our society and institutions, everything that comes from that would sort of help the flourishing of those systems, if you will.
Yes, exactly. I think for the last 200 centuries, we have put a great emphasis on technology and developing of power over nature, but we have not put emphasis on, cultivating our hearts and mind so as to have the wisdom necessary to balance this power and also to deal with the complexity of the world that, power over nature have brought. So, there have been an historical balance into that. And I think as societies, we are very illiterate, I would say, around all these inner dimensions. And one thing that was striking for me when I was doing all this research is first to show, I think, how convincing can be the case to invest in being, and it's still very not well positioned. And second is that in many sectors, even there is a lot of potential of progress for society to invest in these dimensions. And we even have scientific studies that tell us, about the returns for societies, even in investing, for example, in early childhood well-being or investing in mental health. And it's very surprising how little we tap into these opportunities, into these potential. And my explanation is that it's just so unfamiliar to us, because if you look at the data, it's very clear that there are lots of opportunities for progress there, but as societies, we don't look into that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because we have been used not to look into that direction, these potentials have grown a lot because of this disbalance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about the story of interbeing. We've talked about the story of separation, and have certainly alluded to the story of interbeing, but how would you describe or define that to people? What does that look like?
Well, I think it's about, a simple way to say that is to recognize we are above all relational beings, and our identity develops in relationships, first with our parents, and then with all the people that are important in our lives. And we also flourish in relationships. That if you look at happiness studies, well, the main determinant of happiness usually is human relationships, right? And the importance of also of taking care of oneself, which is, let's say, a relationship to ourselves also. And finally, there is also a lot of studies that emphasize the importance of relationship with nature and how important it is for well-being and for mental and physical health. So in this story of interbeing, we recognize how interdependent we are, and that we can't, human flourishing is not something that can happen in isolation from the rest. There's a certain view, this view of happiness, if you look in terms of having, it was associated with more, wealth and at the collective level, economic growth. But studies tell really that does not go very far in terms of well-being and in terms of human flourishing. But when we flourish, we flourish because of these relationships, and as we flourish, we tend to develop more pro-social, pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. So as we flourish, we express more and more our true nature of interbeing.
Mm-hmm. You write in the book about systems and systems theory and complexity, and also really, do a nice job of weaving that together with Buddhist thought, and how in Buddhism, I mean, everything is seen as interrelated and interdependent and sort of co-arising together. I've talked about kind of systems theory a little bit on the podcast, so some listeners might be familiar, but I'm just wondering maybe if we can give kind of a brief overview of what that means. What is kind of complexity theory, and how can people understand that, and what does it have to do with being?
Sure. Well, in all these values, and as you said, no, they have all been at the core of wisdom traditions. And in Buddhism, it would be called right view, which is the first step of the Eightfold Noble Path that the Buddha has taught. Now, it starts with right view, which is the recognition or the interbeing view, let's say. And the path starts with that and ends with that, right? The vision of interbeing. And so when I've and it's interesting because in many of these values and teaching, sometimes we don't, the spiritual aspect of it is not necessarily obvious. But I've noticed that the recognition of our deep interdependence, and even at the being level, is in different traditions. And because this means also that it's very empowering also, because if everything is related, I mean, I think it started myself, in my past, just by acknowledging and paying more attention to how each of my interaction, the depths of what we embody in the world, like every thought is often itself woven in a cultural narrative. And so if you look, the interactions you have with someone, it can have the effects of each of your action, of each of your words, or etc., is infinite, because it will influence someone else, will influence another one, etc., etc. So that's really, and that's the insight of many people working in very complex fields. I talk, for example, of Christiana Figueres, who heads Paris negotiation on climate change, and she said, when basically you're such in a complex endeavor, what you have to change is your own way of being, because that can shape the way the interactions will unfold. And indeed, mental models, mindsets, etc., have been identified by systemic change literature as the most powerful lever for systemic change, right? And I think when you have, there is also this sentence I mentioned in the book, that when you have the sense of complexity, that means you have the sense of interdependency, and then you necessarily have a sense of solidarity, because you understand, how everything is connected, and how how your well-being is not separate from the well-being of others.
Mm-hmm. I would love to bounce an idea off you if I can, Thomas. So we're talking about kind of systems and complexity, and how systems can naturally sort of self-organize and find higher order, especially when they're, at a point of experiencing chaos. We can obviously see that happening in our world today in many different systems. So the question is, like, how do we move from chaos into sort of a reorganization of higher order? And you mentioned kind of this role, this aspect of being. My sort of thought, and this isn't an original thought by any means, is that really the key in reorganizing systems is awareness, is paying attention. Like, simply, like, being aware is the thing that can really help systems to reorganize and to move in to a healthier direction, or lead to the next wisest action. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, as someone who's steeped in, Buddhist practice, and also someone who's studied systems theory.
Yeah, definitely. Otto Scharmer would talk about shared awareness, collective action from shared awareness. So it's not only, one being aware, but also how we realize that we are aware of the same thing, and that can prompt collective action. My main work at the moment is with the United Nations Development Program, leading the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which is purely focused on inner capacities for regenerative food systems. So really focus on the acknowledgement that we need to work on the inner dimensions of change in the food and agriculture systems. And I think this, most of a lot of leaders, including UN Secretary General, they all point at the need to change mindsets. The fact is that we have the capacities to deal with our challenge. We know the technical solutions, and we have the capacity to build a much better world. And still, we are building a world that will not work for anyone. So really, people more and more recognize that the bottom line is to change hearts and minds. And even in these institutions I work with in the UN, you can see that more and more mentioned in the IPCC report on climate change. They are starting to talk about inner transitions and value change, etc. So I think this message is growing quickly. We have also an initiative called the Inner Development Goals, which makes a case for the need to work on these kind of inner qualities, inner skills, so as to be able to achieve sustainability. And there is a growing literature in sustainability science that is backing these views.
That's fascinating. I'm curious to hear more, like, how you're working with people, or these organizations, and developing these, and working with interchange. What sort of kind of interventions or practices are you guys doing?
Sure. So they are very diverse, and it's important that they are context specific and culturally relevant. I think what working with an organization that do this work at the grassroots, what was interesting to notice is that what is often working, how to change, especially adults' mindset, is often through deep conversation. And for this, you need to build a container, a safe space where there is trust and people are able to open up and share their doubts and questions, and from there the people can change their minds, right? Other aspects are these kind of contemplative practices. So there is a lot of science, for example, on mindfulness, and it has shown how mindfulness is effective in terms of cultivating all these inner qualities. So that's another one. And yeah, so it's a lot about, I would say, building the right spaces for deeper conversations, and also individual practices. I think, bringing, and that's our model in my work with UNDP, bringing people together in a community can be very powerful, because often people feel isolated with regard to this kind of agenda. They don't have the right knowledge, they don't have the right language, they don't have the right tools. And when they feel, when we can give them access to all of that, but above all, the peer support, it can make a lot of difference. What we see also is it is about bringing legitimacy to this agenda. So people often feel not entitled to really speak their mind, uh, show up as they truly are, because they feel these kind of inner dimensions are not supposed to come up in the kind of professional discussions they have, etc. So just opening the space and giving legitimacy to all these questions and debates can go a long way.
I love that so much. I mean, it seems to me that that really is one of the primary barriers in making any sort of social change. I mean, if whether you're looking at like food science or climate science or whatever it might be, when people feel like there is an agenda being delivered from the top down and that they're not heard, we're automatically going to encounter some resistance. Or we're seeing this playing out just on different social and political sides. You have people who are, very active and quote believe in climate change, and then people who quote don't believe in climate change, and those people are not having conversations with one another. So I love that you guys are creating the space for that to happen. And again, here it's almost like these qualities of just bearing witness and listening and bringing compassion. This is allowing some more movement to happen versus when those things are not actually present in the equation. So it's really beautiful. I'm curious to hear maybe if you could give like another example or two of other policies that you recommend in the book. I know, full transparency, I'm still working through the book, so I haven't got to this part yet. But I know that you do offer some really concrete solutions. It's, it goes beyond this really beautiful kind of philosophy and rationale that you presented. What are some solutions or examples of solutions that you sort of offer in the way of policy or political kind of actions?
Sure. So that was an important objective also, to show that this can be turned into a very concrete, actionable policy agenda. So there is a very deep and even spiritual vision for evolution of humanity, but it's also a very concrete agenda, so that nobody could deny that all of this is very feasible. It's based on real examples, and this will go a long way to support a full transformation of humanity. So there are 9 sectoral chapters in the book. I think a very important one is the first one about childhood and family, because psychologists all agree that secured attachment to one's parents is fundamental to determine the capacity of people to flourish in the future, and at the same time to contribute positively to society. And there are, as I said, no, there are some scientific research that document that, and sometimes they say like $1 invested in childhood well-being will result in $10 for society. And I was just last week I was discussing with people people at the Ministry of Finance in France, and they were receptive to this kind of studies. And so, well, you can see, societies that are doing better, like the Nordic countries. In Sweden, there is 18 months of parental leaves, where when parents can receive, I think, 80% of their salaries. In the United States, there is no federal parental leave policy. And, the importance of having parents present for their kids is crucial for development of the children. Parenting program is another one, because of course it will have also an impact on children development. All the aspects of how do you monitor and deal with trauma, how do you make to prevent trauma, especially during childhood. Education system, as I said, how do you reorient education system so that they are fit for the 21st century, where it's not about filling pupils' brains with knowledge, because all this knowledge is available online, and we more and more have artificial intelligence, etc. But it's the value added that they will bring to societies is more about their human qualities, how to collaborate, how to innovate, etc., etc. So there are lots of models that have been in education systems. Cooperative learning, often, the way we learn at school is very competitive. Cooperative learning, there's a lot of experience on that, and it shows how effective it is, where pupils support each other to learn. Character education, value-based education. So all, positive education, where we develop the capacities for children to take care of their well-being, is also very important. How we can have topics-based learning in terms of, so you take a topic like, water, for example, and you study it from the different perspective, whether it is through, biology, chemistry, history, geography, etc. And that suits much better the natural way of learning of people. But at the same time, it avoids the kind of separation, disconnection that goes with cutting reality into different pieces through these different disciplines, right? What else are very important? I think in the field, I'm a professional in environmental conservation, we could say. I talk about, and it's very important for me, the rights of nature. So I said, politics of being is for all living beings. And so thus recognizing their rights to be is at the core of this new development paradigm. And that leads us to ask ourselves, because, these different rights, human rights, nature's rights, corporations' rights, they compete with each other. So we need to find a balance, and ask ourselves, when we do an infrastructure project, build a dam or something, do we really need that? Like, what we will get as human being, is that worse what the damage that will be caused to other living beings, right? Well, in the field of economics also, well, the importance of securing everybody's basic needs, that making sure that everybody has its basic needs secured. Also because that's the basis for to allow people to evolve. Sociologists tell us that we are trying to move away from survival values to self-expression values. And an important aspect of that process is feeling the security, material and psychological security that allows us to move into that process of self-expression. As I said, also mental health, I think, is really interesting. And what is interesting that, as I said, in the education system, professionals in that field would reach the same conclusion. So it's not, only coming from the above with this general vision for societies around being. It's also people that are working on concrete solutions in these different sectors. I think the smarter one, I would say, do reach the same conclusion, because it's really, and that means it's a moment for societies to activate this agenda. So, for example, in healthcare, we have an aging population. The main burden is around how do you call them? Chronic disease that are linked to our lifestyle. And, wisdom traditions like the Ayurveda tells us, and science confirms it, that the way we sleep, the way we eat, our levels of stress, etc., are very closely linked to our mental health. So investing in, building healthy lifestyles from a good mental health is a very effective lever to support in general our health systems. So yeah, just a couple of them. I can go on if you like.
Thank you for sharing. No, those are perfect. You were talking a little bit, just a minute ago, about kind of having our basic needs met, and one of the concepts that you talk about in the book is this difference between having and being, and how those two things differ from one another. And being in the having mindset is really, it seems like, an effort to get our basic needs met. It's focused on gaining, security, whether that's economic security or just shelter. And it seems like it really comes from sort of like a fear mindset, versus being is kind of comes out of a mindset of sort of abundance and focusing on these other qualities and values that you've already talked about. My question is, do we need to have those needs met before we can shift into being? Like, in other words, thinking about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, do we need to have those basic needs met? Or can we start with being? Is that possible to start from a place of being? And what does that look like?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And that's a very important question, because even in the Earth Charter, they say when basic needs have been met, human development is primarily about being more. And I'm not so sure of that. And I would argue that I think this agenda of being works well for everyone. First, because having is not an end in itself. Having is a mean. And it's true that for countries at a lower economic development stage, it's true that this economic growth can increase well-being. And after, it reaches certain threshold, then it starts to plateau, right? So it's true that the economic growth can provide more benefits at initial stage, but I would say it's still a mean and not an end. And it's not true that people focus on, this vision of Maslow hierarchy of needs Even Maslow recognized that in reality it does not work like that, and people have all their pursuing different needs at the same time. And what's interesting is that if you look where are the initiatives, political initiatives in particular, where this alternative development paradigm shows up in the world, well, indigenous culture in Bhutan, in Ecuador, or Bolivia, for example, with the Buen Vivir philosophy, what's very striking is that if you read the associated documents, they acknowledge that our well-being comes from our relationship with one another and with the natural world. And you know, Bhutan emphasizes happiness. Buen Vivir is about good living. So this agenda is maybe emerging more in rather poor countries than in richer ones. So I think it goes for different in different ways. You know, I would say in the Western world, it's true that somehow you will see that agenda being, more in richer countries like the Nordic European countries, Switzerland, etc. And there is this logic that we feel we need to be more materially secure before moving towards more self-being agenda, right? But I think, this is because of where we are coming from culturally. But I would say that many cultures, in particular in the global south, have remained much more connected to this being mode of existence, and it resonates much more with them. And it's a little bit, I would say, it's kind of strange from people who have imposed on the world, this kind of individualistic, materialistic values, to consider that others need to have their, basic material needs fulfilled before moving to an agenda of being. To me, it's more a projection of how, it works in our own culture than how it works with cultures in the global south.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially because these material needs, by your standards, have probably never been met in the history of some of these cultures. But still, they have been much more connected to this kind of being values than we have done in the recent past.
Yeah. I love how you draw that distinction. And that was something that, kind of opened my eyes a little bit as I was reading that. Like, oh, it is possible, right? Like it's not like you have to have one thing before the next. And it almost seems like that they're actually, well, I'm curious to get your thoughts. Like, what is the role of ego in this process, like individually and collectively in this shift from having to being? Do you see almost a collective shift happening as far as like the collective ego and how that sort of operates in our psyche as we shift more into a role of being?
Well, yeah, it's clear that the having mode is very related to our ego, right? In the having mode, we kind of compete with each other for scarce resources. And, the fact that in this having mode, what we consider means of happiness are more like wealth, power, fame. On the contrary, the being mode, as we said, now is more related to interbeing, and the more I'm moving into this being or interbeing mode, the more I feel I'm closely linked with everything that is. The more I'm nourishing this kind of connection, not only to myself but also with others and with nature. That I would say for the individual egos. For the collective egos is a very interesting question. I was in a panel last week with a former president of Latvia who said, talking about how countries needed to reduce their egos. And in my book, I talk about the soul of nations, or the genius of nations, as some other people have put it. And it's, I think, always trying to find out, what is a wisdom-based approach to could say globalization. And I have two chapters in my book. One is called One World, and the other one is called Many Nations. So it's really this vision of unity and diversity that you see in nature, and that is a wisdom principle, I would say. And as part of this is a vision of, for example, what is called sometimes a civilization of the universal, in which all nations have something, it's like the organs of one body, which would be the earth, and they all have a function. They all have something special to offer to the world. And sometimes people feel talking about that. And that makes and by the way, that makes a lot of sense in the being mode, because right now nations are competing around the same metrics, GDP, right? That's the kind of metrics who tell us who is more advanced than others. But when we move towards being, it opens a space for much more diversity, because being means differencing in different cultural contexts. Each nation have its own spiritual heritage and its own vision of the good life. And the politics of being is an invitation to, retake that discussion, which is, more complex than just, organizing societies for economic growth. But I think it's very important. So when I talk about the soul of nations, and just it's anchored also into some scientific work, which tell us that cultural evolution is path dependent. So where you come from really will shape where you're going as a culture. So it's an invitation for cultures to reconnect to their wisdom, spiritual roots, their cultural heritage, to chart their version of the politics of being. But sometimes when I talk about soul of nation, people say, wow, that's a very dangerous concept, because it can fuel nationalism, etc. And it's true. And what I say is that, just to explain, and it shows up also how spiritual teaching that applies at the individual can be easily translated at the collective level. So, for example, if I say, I want to become who am I? It's Thomas. It's not like I will list the qualities of Thomas and try to stick to them. No, it is something much more emergent. Like I'm striving for what is my calling, what do I feel is right to do, where, and through this emerge, a truer, more authentic Thomas. And I think that is the same with nations. What the unique qualities they can express is something that the nationalistic ego can't really control and carve in stone. So
I so appreciate how you're able to draw these parallels between kind of these principles, whether it's spiritual principles or scientific principles, on the individual level and the collective level as well. Love that. Is there anything else that we haven't covered today that you were hoping to share? There's so much here, and I myself, I know I'm going to have to go back and play this a couple times to really absorb all of the wisdom here, but anything else that you wanted to share?
I'm not sure, Matthew. Let's see. Well, maybe just to tell that this has been a long journey for me that took me 10 years to research and write this book, and it has been released in January this year. It was particularly special for me because it was released the day my teacher, Zen master Thich Nhat passed away. And I'm very happy how this book is now received by many thought leaders. I was always struggling with the question, why this book has not yet been written? Because, it's based on some this statement that I've mentioned from the Earth Charter 20 years ago that said development is about being more, which I think is a very important statement. I've been very surprised that nobody tried really to figure out, what this can mean theoretically, but also practically. And I've tried to, with this book, I had a very clear objectives. One was to make a good case for it based on a strong science and root this in the political and sustainability conversations. The other one was to provide a common framework for all these kind of claims, initiative, communities around this agenda that often look disconnected from one another, and just try to show that they are part of the same new cultural narrative, the story of interbeing, but also a same new development paradigm I call the politics of being. And because I think we need really to unite all these different cells of the politics of being, and finally to show that this can be a very concrete actionable policy agenda. So I think that's a very positive message full of hope that when you read the book, it's hard to deny that in principle we could implement all of that tomorrow. I mean, it's already implemented in different parts of the world. It's about connecting that into an overarching narrative and a new vision of progress. But that really tells us that a much better world is really we're not so far from being able to create it. And it's true that we are tend to look about with fears into the destruction that is coming, the collapses that maybe are often needed to give birth to something new. But maybe I would say the most important question is not so much about, to what extent will collapse, but rather to what extent we'll be able to do this kind of cultural evolution. I call it even a spiritual evolution of humanity, which has been announced also by many prophets. And, when you come from that, it's kind of very energizing to see that, it's not something of prophet. Now it's something that scientists and people at the UN are actually discussing, and we are all recognizing, that will be the key for the transition to come. So yeah, that's maybe the messages I wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I did not know that, people in the UN, for example, were having these conversations. And I'm just glad that that you are, part of these conversations in the ways that you are. And like you said, that you were really able to bring in some practical recommendations with this book and with your work. I think it's, it's very easy for people to kind of like write off these ideas in theory, because they're so wonderful and they're so beautiful, but to actually tie that into actionable, concrete steps that we can take is something that has really been missing, I think, from like, the broader literature and people's work. So thank you for doing that. I will link to the book and to your website and everything in the show notes, but where else can people find you? Are you on social media or have a personal website, or where can people find your work?
Yeah, sure. There's a Politics of Being website, www.politicsofbeing.com. There's a YouTube channel with lots of materials, presentation, podcast. And I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram with Politics of Being often. So, and on Twitter soon.
Okay, fantastic. Awesome. Thomas, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Matthew. Thanks. It was great discussing with you. Thank you very much for your work.
Of course.